Every year, this small English village in the Peak District attracts tens of thousands of people after hearing that it was once afflicted by a plague in the 17th century. The story goes that a parcel arrived from London into this small village filled with fine London material for the local tailor, and after being opened by one of the men of the village, known as George Vickers, he was struck with illness and later died. At the time, London and surrounding areas were going through what is known in history as the Great Plague of London. It started from a bacterial infection caused by Yersinia pestis, causing the death of around 20% of the population of London at the time. This disease somehow also made its way towards the north of the country to a village called Eyam. Located within the beautiful and often visited Peak District National Park, this was a village which was not really spoken about much. It is located between Buxton and Sheffield and has a mere population of just under 1,000 people. But what made this village so heroic in many people's view? Well, it is believed that the residents of the village were some of the first few people who introduced a self-imposed style of quarantine instead of fleeing, which some rich folks of course did, like King Charles II, who ran away when the Great Plague of London took place. The village folks of Eyam were wise to impose quarantine upon themselves, recording themselves in history as a selfless community who had impressive leadership. The quarantine by the community of the village was mainly done to limit the spread of the disease. Church services were held in the open air with villagers social distancing. This imposed style of quarantine of Eyam village is undoubtedly the main reason that it is known and visited. Now, let's just stop here for a while. This narrative is pretty well known and has been written about in the form of poems, books and many news articles. But how much of the narrative is actually true? In May 2005, Patrick Wallace published a paper discussing the historical narrative in which he mentions that although the Plague of Eyam in 1666 is one of the most famous outbreaks of epidemic disease in British history, the narrative is largely a fiction, produced not by doctors but by poets, writers and local historians. He even goes on to mention that the story was at most a minor anecdote before the last decade of the 18th century. Basically, the story started gaining popularity due to being portrayed in poems, novels, plays, musicals and even in a children's television drama. There's not a lot of evidence suggesting what exactly transpired in Eyam at the time, but one thing we know for sure is that the general idea of Eyam village being afflicted with the plague basically provides us with bare bones of the version that was popularised in the 19th century and which survived for much of the 20th century. Whatever the case, the village of Eyam is an interesting place to visit if you're interested in learning about the Great Plague of London and how it afflicted other parts of England in the 17th century. Inhabitants of the village most likely did consider others and therefore did impose upon them this self-styled quarantine, a selfless group of people who thought considerately about not harming others. But I'd take things with a pinch of salt if you do visit. A huge thanks to the team at the Eyam Museum for showing us around and for all the hard work they put into making visits interactive and engaging. If you have time when you visit the village, it's worth visiting the Eyam Museum to see an illustrated view of what exactly transpired at the time. If you'd like to visit and want to know more, be sure to check the information in the description below.